Hello again. We're back for our latest episode of Boardroom RevOps, where we're bringing you valuable tips from RevOps experts so you can make it to the C-suite. I'm James, co-founder of Accounting, the RevOps BI platform. Going to be a great episode today. I have Daire Manning joining me today. Daire worked his way up from sales ops analyst to head of international strategy and ops at HubSpot, a company that you have probably heard about, and then went on to become VP of Commercial Ops at Tebra, leading a team of, I think, over 30. Daire, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me, James.
We're going to chat about one of my favorite topics today. I always think it's super interesting to get folks' perspective, and it's how to make it to VP in the world of RevOps. I think it's like kind of a vague career path for many. So excited to hear kind of how this worked for you. But real quick, anything I missed on your background? What else should folks know?
No, I think you nailed it. I mean, kind of currently I'm working with a couple different companies, most prominently a company called FinCore. I lead their customer team. It's a kind of a revenue analytics platform. But yeah, no, I think you nailed the background, and I'm loath to talk about myself any more than you already have. So I'll stop it.
All right, well, we'll dive right in, but feel free to do all the self-promo you want. So let's dive in. Making VP of RevOps. Like, Daire, do you have like a mental model for kind of becoming a good like RevOps professional leader, kind of working up the ladder?
Yeah, so I think this is my mental model. I don't know how generalizable this is, and I would love your thoughts on it as well. But my mental model is, as a RevOps leader, you're not gonna be leading a team that is massive, generally speaking. The team I led at Tebra was probably on the upper end of what you would expect to be leading, unless you're like leading RevOps at a very large public company or something like that. And so I think what that means is that you're always going to have to be somewhat in the details. It's very rare that you're going to have a set of leaders, functional specialist leaders under you that are handling every single aspect of every single detail, and you're freed up to just do the higher level stuff. So you got to stay close to the crafts. And the other piece that I think it means is that you have to be a generalist. You can have places that you have preferences for or specialize in, but you're probably going to have to be 80th percentile or better at a variety of different things. Budgeting and planning would be kind of one discipline. Analytics is maybe another discipline. Kind of systems and process and systems admin is a third. You can kind of list out the disciplines. You don't need to be the best person at any given one of those, but you do need to understand them well enough to guide teams and get stuck in when you have to. So that's kind of my rough mental model is, try not to be a hyper specialist if you're looking to make VP at a reasonably sized org at any point in time, and being good enough is good enough sometimes.
Yeah, I think that covers it really well. My perspective is pretty similar, but maybe framed slightly differently. I think of it as like execution and strategy and across the whole business as well. And so I think it's kind of parroting what you said, but having to understand the data, be in the weeds, but also translate it to what executives actually want to talk about. And that's where I think a lot of RevOps folks actually get hung up. They can be really good at the systems, really good at the data side, but actually translating that to what it means for the business is a challenge.
100%. And I think one related thing that I think tripped me up, and I think can trip people up and continues to trip me up, is I think probably the most important thing if you're a RevOps professional is having a good understanding of how good enough is in a given situation. Because if you're very detail orientated and you're sweating every detail all the time, you're going to get bogged down and you're not going to get enough done. And for better or for worse, at any org that I've ever worked in or with, it's a high velocity role where the expectation is that you're getting a lot done, right? And some things don't need to be perfect. Like a sales leader asks you, how many opportunities did we create last week? If that answer is an opportunity or two off, it literally does not matter. It's not going to change the conclusion, and it's not going to change the action, and it doesn't matter. So you should just get an answer that's good enough and get it over and move on with your life, right? But if you're doing something like building a commission plan, right, and you're sizing rates or something like that, that is a high precision task. And you do need to set aside the time and have the discipline to make sure that all of the details are right. And I think when I've gotten myself into trouble in my career, it's when I approached one of those problems with a level of rigor that wasn't appropriate in either direction, like putting way too much time into something that didn't warrant it, right? Or not putting sufficient time into something where the details really mattered. That's where I've kind of made a lot of my mistakes.
I know it's really a judgment call, but how do you kind of assess what is a high precision task versus a lower precision task?
I think my general rule of thumb is if the decision impacts money changing hands, then it's a high precision task. Commissions is a high precision task. If you're doing some sort of deal desk activity, right, and you're thinking about contractual terms, that's a high precision task. Budgeting, that's a high precision task. If it's more, if the output of whatever analysis or piece of work you're doing is more operational, right, it's like someone's going to have a conversation off the back of it or something like that, that can be a little bit lower, and you can apply some judgment as to like there's obviously a continuum there as to how much rigor is appropriate. But my general rubric is like if an invoice or a paycheck depends on the piece of work that you're doing, then it's generally going to be high precision.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think anger or level of upset is probably higher when there's money involved, so it's probably a good way to kind of cut through the noise.
Yeah, for sure. Exactly. That's a pretty good rubric.
So you summarized a few categories of things to be thinking about, to be good at, to kind of climb the RevOps ladder. I think you said analytics, budgeting and planning, systems. I'm also going to throw in just like hiring and running a team as you scale. Where do you think most RevOps folks kind of fall over amongst these four things?
I don't know if it's any individual specific discipline per se. I think it's a little bit more about kind of attributes that folks have. So like I think if you're going to be a RevOps person, you need to have a high degree of comfort with ambiguity. It's not a role that's well defined almost anywhere. And you got to be comfortable with that. If you're looking for a highly defined role, then RevOps probably isn't the place for you. Or you're gonna like carve out a niche for yourself in one of those specific disciplines that I mentioned, right? Like you might decide like I'm just gonna be really good at analytics and spend all of your time, working in a data warehouse and writing SQL and DBT, building DBT models and building dashboards and all that sort of stuff. And you might be great at that, but if that's what you want to spend 100% of your time on, you're probably not going to be a VP of RevOps, right? Like you'll probably be a functional specialist within a RevOps team, and that's okay, but you need to make sure you're comfortable with that trade-off. So for me, it's more about, do you have a curiosity to like learn different things, and get good at different things over time, up to kind of like like you don't need to be the best, but like an 80th percentile type level competence. Like I think you need to have a love of learning and a curiosity there. And then a comfort with ambiguity as well. I think it's more like those things that are important. And I think I wouldn't even say people get tripped up, but like I think if you decide to be a specialist, I think you need to understand that you should probably be, and you want to grow your career and have a big title, you should probably do so with the understanding that the only real place for you to do that is at a large org that is going to have a very big like RevOps analytics team or something like that. It's probably not going to happen for you at a small org that needs a generalist.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So if we kind of break these down, then I'm curious, like on the analytics side of things, like tell me more about what it means to be good at the analytical components. And I'm thinking through a few kind of lenses here. I'm trying to lead the witness, but you mentioned like the level of precision, which I think is a really great comment. I'm also thinking through like, where do analytics start and stop, right? There's the analysis, there's what you do with the analysis. I feel like this is all kind of like tied together. So yeah, tell me more from your experience. Like, what did it mean to do that well?
And just as clarifying, when you say analytical skills, do you mean in the sense of like an ability to take an ambiguous problem and break it down, or do you mean like a little bit more technically, right? Like an ability to like build analytical products, like analytics products?
I think more technically, yeah, whether it's, BI and dashboarding and Salesforce reports, it's even maybe some of the supporting analytics that go with like budgeting, planning.
Yeah. So I guess the way I would think about that is there's kind of like a data production line of sorts, right? So you've got a number of source systems in any given business where people are actually executing on the work. So like a CRM or an ERP or whatever, that's where the data is created. Then, you can do a couple of things from there, but you got to get it out into, generally speaking, into another tool in order to really make it come to life, because any given system is not going to have the data from all of the systems. So that can be a data warehouse or a data lake, or it can be another type of tool, around which I think you are probably very familiar, right? And so I think from there it comes back to, I think you need to have a deep understanding of the business such that you know which data products that you need to create. And when I say data products, I guess to think about it in terms of like layers of extraction, you've got raw source data, right? And then you've got dashboards, like outputs where someone is actually taking an action. But in between, and this is a concept that's very familiar to you, and I think probably any sort of an analytics professional, you should have some data products that sit in between that, where you're taking raw data, transforming it or modeling it in a way that's consistent at getting to more like summary measures or clean measures. And then those are what you're building all of your kind of like front-facing, user-facing products off of. And I think the trick is like, in order to do a good job at knowing what those kind of like source of truth tables should be and what the lines between them should be, you need to have very good business context and understanding of how the business actually works, right? And so you obviously need a set of technical skills to do the technical work of doing the data transformation in whatever tool you're doing it in, right? Like that's a given, right? But I think the more important part is having your own mental model of how the business works, because your mental model of how the business works is what gets represented as those kind of like data products that sit under all of your analytics.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, and I think it kind of comes into play of like taking a step back and asking yourself for the business, like, what are we actually building for? I think a gap I see is some folks will say, oh, a VP of sales just asked for this report and they go straight into building. But it's like, what actions is the VP of sales actually trying to take? What are we trying to do with that information? And getting folks what they need and not necessarily what they ask for. I think that's where something like the business logic and the kind of judgment and even almost sales level discovery of your stakeholders kind of comes into play.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, again, this is a problem I'm sure you're really familiar with, but I think one of the most basic things that you need to ask when anyone asks you for any sort of a kind of a data output or report or whatever is like, what are you looking to use it for? I think if you position yourself as an order taker, then that's the way you will be treated, right? And oftentimes people will ask for something that doesn't actually meet their needs, right? And I think a lot of the value of being a really solid RevOps business partner is in understanding the motivations of the person that you're working with and solving the problems on their behalf, right? Rather than just kind of being a recipient of requests.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's well put. The last thing I would add here as well, just on the analytics side, because as you said, is kind of near and dear to me, is like the semantic layer, even like laying out the true definitions of all the metrics that the business cares about. I've seen time and time again, sales and marketing becomes misaligned simply because of like a metric definition issue as well. So I don't know if that's something you've come across, but it's something we see as well on the analytics side.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's why it's important to have these like
Data products, right? Like you have a column in a table somewhere that codifies like, okay, when we say $1 of ARR, this is what $1 of ARR is, right? And there's obviously a data dictionary version of that you should have sitting out somewhere, but like the more important place is to have somewhere that people can go to pull it in an easy way, right? Rather than having to piece it together from raw source system data.
Yeah, definitely. I want to take like a pit stop here into some of your career experience because I think it's really interesting. Grew pretty quickly at HubSpot, and I'm even just looking at your resume here to ultimately lead like international strategy and ops. I guess as I think about that, was that primarily like an analytical exercise, or like what was the scope of that role as you think about even you kind of started as a analyst manager moving up, and maybe the answer is it wasn't a very analytical role, but I'm kind of just curious to hear like the context of your career growth there.
Yeah, it was a bit. I mean, I think so. The journey HubSpot. So when I joined HubSpot, I joined in 2014, and at the time, the reporting stack was a CRM that you would dump CSVs out of into Excel and do analysis there, which is probably the way a lot of orgs still work today. And it can work fine. But over time, we did put in place like a real kind of like data stack, right? So we put in place initially it was a Redshift data warehouse, and then Looker sat on top of that, and then we began building a lot of the kind of analytical resources that we needed on top of that. And so I did have some involvement with that effort. I'm not a data engineer, so like the ETL piece of like getting data out of source systems into the data warehouse was not something that I did, but the building of reporting on top of it is something that I contributed to, and over time kind of built out a small team of technical folks under me of what's now called like analytics engineers to kind of manage that on and on.
Got it. Makes sense. Anything else as we think about and kind of we step back from analytics now and think about like the rise to VP? Like obviously to me it looks like HubSpot was a foundational kind of stepping stone to then kind of getting the role at Tebra. Like anything in addition or tangential to what we kind of already discussed around like why you're able to succeed at HubSpot? Any reflections that could be construed as like advice for folks that might be in the earlier middle parts of their career?
Well, I mean, look, I think there's a lot of luck and timing in this stuff, and I think it's good to not get too hung up on your success or your measures of success in any given kind of quarter or year or whatever. Like I was definitely in the right place at the right time when I joined HubSpot and also when I joined PatientPop, which became Tebra too. So I've been very lucky. I think to the extent that I had anything to do with that, I think a lot of it is I've always had very much kind of like an outcomes orientation. So like I'm okay with the sausage being made in some sort of imperfect way or non-elegant way, so long as the result is good. And one of the ways that that's manifested in my various roles is I've always tried really hard to be an effective business partner to whatever revenue leader I was supporting, right? So helping them come up with what the strategic priorities should be, so kind of doing strategic work to define the problem and a sketch of the solution,
but also very much like leading the execution, kind of that strategy execution paradigm you were talking about, but like very tightly aligned with whatever leader you are supporting and we're being really hand in glove with that person. Like, I think that's extremely, extremely important. And so I think to the extent that I got anything right, I do think I got that piece right, with the various leaders that I worked with all the way up at HubSpot, and then similarly at Tebra. I think having a really strong partnership there is the most important thing that you can do.
Yeah. In your experience, and then we'll dive kind of back into some of the more tactical stuff within the categories. I think the biggest challenge, kind of alluding to this earlier, for some folks is pulling back and having those strategic conversations with their leaders. Like, what do you think your leaders were kind of looking for from you and their other like RevOps leaders from that strategy building perspective, right? Because I think some folks will be like, oh, I don't want to step on their toes, or oh, I'm just a RevOps analyst and kind of in the weeds. Like, where do you think RevOps can add the most value, like in those strategic conversations?
I mean, I think the fact that RevOps people are generally going to think about the business in a very analytical fashion helps bring some objectivity to discussions that are in reality like quite messy, and often I think what's hard is like, you do need to have a really strong grasp of the details for sure in the role, don't get me wrong. But like a lot of the job is distilling that detail into simple takeaways. And the way I've always done that is like, you need to have a very simple mental model of how the business works and makes money, right? Like, not many people in organizations think about things in like very concrete equation-like terms, right? But I think as a RevOps person, part of what you can do is bring discipline to discussion by forcing the conversation in those terms. And like someone like yourself who's got a banking background will be very good at this. But like, to give an example, if you're working in a transactional business, and with a very short sales cycle, your mental model of the business might just be like, we generate a certain number of leads, they convert into opportunities at a certain rate, they close into deals at a certain rate and at a certain deal size, and then we have an ongoing retention rate that we monitor. So you've got like 5 metrics that matter in the business. Like, it's a pretty simple mental model, right? And inevitably, when you're in any discussion in real life where there's many people in the room arguing over what matters and what doesn't matter, the conversation will be about everything that's not those 5 metrics, right? And your job is to try and get back to the 1 or 2 things that matter at a given point in time and try and focus the conversation. And so for me, like that's one of the key jobs of a business partner is like, you need to have a simple mental model of the business, number one. You need to know what those numbers are at any given point in time and how they're trending and why they're moving around, number 2, right? But then you also need to have the reputation and the discipline and the courage to bring that up in conversations with people that are generally going to be more senior than you, to try and get them to focus on the things that matter rather than wherever the noise is in the business at a given point in time, which might be correlated to impact but isn't the same thing as impact.
I couldn't agree more. And I think like very tactically, we'll often recommend to customers and prospects that they build that go-to-market model live, right? And you have those kind of like the top to bottom funnel metrics basically that you can always kind of point back to and see how they're trending, and to your point, relate every kind of conversation to them. That's actually like a good segue too. You mentioned like budgeting and planning was one of the 4 categories, if you allow me to throw in the building a team as a category, that RevOps should be good at. It feels like that's very related. Is that where you think RevOps can kind of provide the most value from the budgeting and planning process, or is there a different set of like competencies on that front?
I think so. I mean, look, budgeting and planning gets done in different ways at every org, right? And your FP&A team should be the ones primarily driving the budgeting process, typically speaking. But I think where RevOps teams can add a lot of value is, inevitably in any budgeting process at an ambitious org, you're not just dragging the spreadsheet forward, you're trying to find intelligent bets that you can place to accelerate growth, right? And bringing a disciplined analytical perspective to like what the best risk-weighted bets are, I think is an important job of the RevOps team, because an FP&A team, again, I'm painting it with a bit of a broad brush here, but an FP&A analyst or lead is generally going to be managing a pretty wide swath of the business. It's hard for them to be really close to the people that are working in that business such that they understand the context beyond the high-level P&L numbers that go into like what a good risk-weighted bet is. And so like bringing a disciplined analytical perspective to complement whatever kind of more anecdotal perspective like the leader of that function will have, I think is a really important discipline as part of the budgeting process. And then in addition to that, there's a bunch more kind of like meat and potatoes type things that
that I've generally owned during the planning process. So forecasting what quota coverage is going to be would be a really typical one, or what the expense and commissions impact of various compensation plan changes is going to be is something that, you know, my teams have managed in the past or whatever. And so you need very much, I think, to do that well, an FP&A skill set, which is part of what makes RevOps hard, right? Like you need to be able to do that job almost as well, not quite as well, but almost as well as your equivalent peer in an FP&A department, while also doing the systems and process and while also doing some element of the analytics. I think that's what makes the job tricky.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I wish we had more time to dig in there, but we have 5 minutes left on the clock. So I want to kind of fill the bulk of the time on kind of hiring and running a team, because I think you had a really good run at this at Tebra. So I think the team was kind of quite large there. Like, I think one challenge I see in RevOps is for some, it's hard to get resources to grow the team. It's quote unquote not a revenue driver, which I ultimately disagree with, but I see why people say this. And you know, it always feels easier for leadership to say, oh, we'll just hire another seller rather than RevOps. So like, tell me just the context of like, how did your team progress? Like, how did you guys get the resources, make the case to kind of grow here?
Yeah, well, I guess the first thing to say is like my team at Tebra, I don't think it was quite as large as you said. I think it was somewhere in the mid-20s at its peak. But
okay.
It was really a collection of things, of some things that you would not ordinarily deem to be
RevOps. So it was kind of sales operations and CS operations, and there was an analytics team, and then there was also some kind of like related support functions around project and program management. There was like a workforce planning analyst for the support team, stuff like that. So it was really kind of like fairly broad. I don't think it would be typical to have like a more narrowly defined RevOps team that was that large,
sure,
unless you're at a very big company. I think for me, the way it kind of developed was more around, I think we kind of built a bit of an internal reputation as being really good business partners, you know. And I think if you're a really good business partner, sales like CRO or a sales VP or a CEO, like they're not going to mind investing when the value is obvious, right? Even if it's a little fuzzy, right? Like if you're able to deliver value that's perceived as 5 or 10x, you know, the resourcing will kind of just come along with that. And so I think staying close to your business partners, understanding what's important to them, like really being almost like a chief of staff for whoever it is that you're supporting, is probably the most important thing. If they perceive you to be valuable, then the resourcing to some extent figures itself out. You know, you still need to have conversations around that sometimes. But I think, again, I'm painting with a bit of a broad brush here, but I think to the extent that folks are struggling to get resources, it's maybe that they're delivering value in a way that they perceive to be important, and it might even objectively be important, but it might not be the way whoever approves the resources perceives value to be delivered. And there's a mismatch there in perception. I think that's probably where things get tricky.
That's a really good point. How do you, in your experience, so we talked about being a good business partner briefly earlier, and you mentioned some of like the high level strategic planning, so that makes sense. I think one trap a lot of RevOps folks fall into is that it's like a fire hose. Like I'm trying to support the CRO, he or she is just sending so many things my way. I imagine you felt some overload at times too. Like how do you balance prioritization or pushing back on some of those things so you can actually get the most important things done?
So I think you should have a formal prioritization process if your team is at any level of scale and your org has some level of stability in it, like you're not at a 5-person org. So the way I've generally done that is to set priorities quarterly, get a lot of feedback on what the priorities should be ahead of that from a variety of leaders in the business, set them and then try and stick to them as much as you can. And if you need to change the priorities, doesn't need to be a huge conversation, but it should be a conversation, right? Like we are deprioritizing this in favor of taking this new thing on, and we're all making that decision together and okay with it. But I think, again, and I'm not trying to like demean or belittle anyone who's experiencing the fire hose right now. It is real and I've experienced it myself. But I think the main levers that you have to counteract that are, again, I know I'm being a bit of a broken record here, but if like being a really good business partner, like if you're just getting like shot a bunch of different requests all the time, right? It might be that the work you're doing a great job delivering, but the thing that's getting delivered isn't actually solving the problem, right? And you need to take a bit of time to do a bit of extra discovery to try and learn what the true problem is, right? I think the other thing that might get in the way is like you don't have a perspective yourself on what the right solutions are, right? And you should develop that and have a dialogue with your leader about what they should be, right? And it might be that like this is a problem.
Yeah, there's really a theme in your responses around just like ownership too. It's like you are in control, or you should at least strive to be in control and take some ownership on solutions and prioritization and pushing back where needed. I think some people are kind of nervous to do that, but I think people will ultimately kind of appreciate it if you can bring kind of order to the madness.
Totally. And I think, I guess what I would say to anyone is like, I think there are very few jobs. The ambiguity is a gift. There are very few jobs where you get to kind of like pick and choose what to work on, right? And that means that this is a very high leverage role, and you should feel that way, and you should be confident about your ability to deliver value in the role, you know? And I think if you lose that confidence, I think you'll start slinking back into more order taker mode. And I think that's a little bit of a negative spiral because for all the reasons that we already discussed, right? So you definitely do need to have a sense of self in the job, you know.
For sure. Daire, I know we're almost at time here. The last thing, kind of a catch-all I wanted to ask you, there's so many questions I wanted to go deeper on building a team, but any learnings or things that surprised you about building, growing, managing a big team that you would highlight here?
I think, I guess I'll maybe share one thing on hiring. So, standard generic hiring advice, but you need to have, again, a mental model of what the skill areas you need to have in order to be good at the job are. You need to know how good someone needs to be at any one of those things. So you might not need like an A grade on analytical competence, but you might need a B grade, right? And then you should set up your interview process so that you're testing on each of those at different phases, and ideally testing such that people are showing you the work. So like that can be in the form of showing you a work product they produced previously. It can be a case study. It can be something else. But in my experience, there's no substitute for seeing the work. I've interviewed people where the behavioral interview went awesome, and I was super impressed. And then we had them actually do the work, and it was night and day, and it was a definite no-go. And I've had the flip as well, where someone was a little nervous and maybe not the best in a behavioral interview, but they really nailed the work, right? And so I think that's the key. Like if you hire well, a lot of stuff looks after itself. That's the key to kind of having a good, high-functioning large team. And I think that mostly comes down to just having a good, clear picture for what you're hiring for and structuring a process that actually tests for it.
That's great. Yeah, I think it's easy to not be thoughtful on the hiring front because you're so busy, but I think that's a really great framework for doing so. Well, Daire, thank you so much. I thought this was awesome. Some great learnings there from someone who made it up to VP, so I'm grateful that you came on and shared with it. And anyone listening, if you have any questions for Daire about this, feel free to shoot them my way, and I can kind of batch them up and get them to him for responses. So thanks again for joining, man. It's great.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, James.